Both my grandfathers on my mother and father's side paid the head tax, and both my grandfathers were separated from their wives for a period of 2 decades and more.
This was a white supremacist society.
One of the legacies of all this comes out of what is called heathens without souls. We were treated, that is, the Chinese were treated the way we were treated because we weren't seen as human.
We were like South Africa. We were like Australia. They had explicit policies. South Africa had apartheid. Australia had a white Australia policy. We actually had a white Canada policy.
Chink. Chink is our legacy from this. Chink means a weakness. And chink means when you're called to chink, it means you're too weak. You don't deserve justice.
One of the hallmarks of white supremacy is if you're not white, you don't get to vote. Until 1947 in Canada, if you weren't white, you didn't get to vote. Everything that we know about apartheid, we had housing segregation in South Africa. We had that. There's areas of, Vancouver, if you weren't white, you weren't allowed to live there. We had job discrimination, professions. We had laws up to 1947. If you can't vote, you can't be a doctor. If you can't vote, you can't be a lawyer. If you can't vote, you can't be in any of the professions. That sure sounds like South Africa to me.
The gold miners, the railway workers, all these people, if you apologize to the Chinese-Canadian community, I dare say that 5-6 of them wouldn't even understand what it's about.
In 1967, we changed our immigration laws so that it was no longer white supremacist. Before, we had a preferential immigration for people from Europe, and all non-white peoples was either they were excluded, couldn't come to Canada, or it was incredibly difficult, or you had things like the head tax where you charged Chinese 2 or 3 years' wages in order just to have the privilege of coming to Canada.
The Harper government left us with an incomplete redress. They took the photo ops, they did the vote pandering, and essentially they redressed less than 800 families out of 80,000 families. So an apology and a partial redress, it's nice, it's a good step, but what we need, what my grandfather would say is what we need on this is total redress.
I think one of the hardest things for most Canadians to understand, because they haven't been taught this history in school books, and often people who find out about it, they read on their own, they learn about it by hearing from people who were interned if they're Japanese Canadian, or people who went through the residential schooling experience. One of the most difficult things for most Canadians is understanding the legacies of that long history of white supremacy.
We weren't seen as human, and the result of that is you can do anything. You can separate their families, you can charge them an unjust tax, you can do all these things.
Because we peaceably dismantled many of the laws and removed those very overt structures, disenfranchisement of non-whites, housing segregation, job segregation. Because we removed those relatively quietly, it's harder to see other legacies.
We get a just and honorable redress. We put the chink to rest.
I think there's a lot of hope for the future, and the reason why is because I think it's easier to convince a younger generation to do the right thing. And so my hope is that through education, through actually teaching about what our history was and how we still live in that history, that we didn't stop history. Our hope is that education is about taking young people, getting them to think, getting them to own the history of this nation, to own up to the parts that were dark and maybe not so fair, and then also own the future. Like, what are they going to do about it? How are they going to help make a better society for themselves and their children? To me, the past is alive all around us, and it's particularly alive for those younger people who have the most ahead of them. And for them, history should be important, because without understanding where they are now and who they are now and having a role in defining it, then they don't have much of a future. So to me, my hope is in the future of younger people.